Good evening and welcome to the first meeting of this chapter of the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius. And we have my colleague Ron Dart from the Anglican branch of the fellowship, and Sister Nona from California has come to speak to us from the Orthodox wing of the fellowship. And Sister Nona's history with the fellowship goes back some distance to when she was studying at Oxford in the United Kingdom.
In the 1970s.
1970s, and so she's been involved with the fellowship longer than any of us. And we're trying to establish this fellowship chapter here in British Columbia, and for the whole West Coast, really. And this is the first formal event since this chapter began. And really, this chapter was founded really on the idea of Ron Dart, who was the most anxious to get it founded and rolling. So we've begun to cooperate on it. And the theme for this first meeting, and Sister Nona and David Goa will be speaking to us tomorrow, and perhaps Ron Dart, about the idea that we have responsibilities that go beyond the boundaries of our churches into general society, and responsibilities to other Christians as well. That not in preaching our doctrine or trying to force our doctrine on the people, but responsibilities to society and the community itself. So I'm going to ask our two guests to give us, first of all, a summary of how they see this, these responsibilities, what they feel the responsibilities are, and then we'll try to tease out a little more discussion about some of the specifics of it. And I'm going to ask Sister Nona, because ladies are first, to give us some general idea of what you feel the responsibility of the church is to the greater community.
Thank you, Father, for inviting me, and Vladika for inviting me. Let's begin with caring for people in need. This is something that the churches have always done. And what was distinctive in the ancient times was that, unlike other religious groups or family groups or labor union type groups or business type groups in ancient times that would take care of their own, or people would take care of their own ethnic group, Christians would offer charity to everyone who needed it. And so people who'd fallen through the cracks in ancient society could go there, or even if they hadn't fallen through the cracks, if they were still in need, they could go and Christians would help them. So this meant that the poorest of the poor, the people who were neglected by everyone in society, they were now members. They now had a social identity as members of this group that were receiving charity, as maybe connected with other people who were in the same plight, and they were visible in the social world, as well as getting food and health care or whatever it is they needed. So that has always been one thing that the church has done. And the poor are always with us, as our Lord says. So there's always a need for it one way or another. And it isn't done for the purpose of evangelism, but sometimes people may be attracted to the church as a result, sort of as a side benefit of that. Then the other thing that I suggested that the church was asked to do in ancient times to contribute to society as a whole. This came from Augustine in North Africa, which had become a Christian area by the early 5th century. But there were needs, political and military needs that the community had. And somebody had to meet those needs. Somebody had to provide order and security so that people could live and carry on their personal lives and their economic lives. And there was also a need for honest judges to judge disputes or criminal cases that came up. And there were various other offices that needed to be filled. And if Christians never did these for reasons of conscience, which the early Christians did before Constantine, they wouldn't join the army and they wouldn't serve as judges because they might have to do something that would go against their conscience. The soldier might have to kill people, and the judge too might be required by law in the Roman system to order people tortured, which might end up killing them also and cause a lot of pain. So they didn't want to be in that position. But Augustine said that Christians have to do these jobs for the sake of others, because the community as a whole needs to have these jobs done. So there's a suggestion there that engagement in civic life, engagement even in political life, may be necessary as a way of serving others. So I could tell you some stories about that, but I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, well, Pliny, I think one of the first persecutors of Christians in Cappadocia was governor in the east. And he had commented that what made the Christians so dangerous was that they didn't care only for their own, but they cared for all without distinction. They never limited the care they gave just to their own group, but they would care for everyone. And he somehow thought that made them pose a danger well, certainly to the worship of the emperor as God. Ron, what would you like to share with us about the responsibility, I don't say obligations, but responsibilities to the greater community?
Well, I think one of the dilemmas we face in the West is certainly since the 16th century, with the rise of Protestant denominations, is that you would, whether from within the Lutheran or Reformed or Anabaptist or Baptist, you had a variety of forms of Christianity that in fact were not working together because they all in their different ways thought that their interpretation was more substantive than the other denominational tradition. And so there's a history in the West, certainly, of forms of Christianity at an ecclesial level that don't work together. And that form of tribalism, I think, is being overcome. The second point to note that with the coming of the 16th century, there was a fragment in terms of the relationship of church and state. The magisterial tradition, which Anglicanism comes from, Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Reformed, recognizes that Christians do have a responsibility at the level of the state to be agents of salt, light, and yeast, both at a grassroots level and from a state-down level. This was quite different from certain forms of the Anabaptist tradition, which emerged from Michael Sattler and the Schleitheim Confession, in which the Anabaptists were very suspicious of the magisterial church and saw themselves as the pure remnant, so they retreated from the state into small religious enclaves. And so within the Western tradition, there are different answers to that question based on some of the things which occurred within the Reformation. Now, I think what's occurring now is that many of these denominational traditions, which have been historically separate from one another on these larger justice, peace, environmental issues, are realizing they no more can live in splendid solitude or throw rocks at one another. They realize the future of the church hinges on coming back together and working together as a people of God. And so the Anglican tradition, its history, is a magisterial tradition going right back to the 1st century, where the Society of St. Alban and St. Sergius, St. Alban was the first martyr, because he was dealing with substantive issues of war and peace and justice and injustice. And so right from the 1st century forward, you can see the English church, obviously it was not called that at the time, but the church in what was called Albion at that particular time was engaged with the magistrate, was engaged with what would have been called some form of the state, local ruling in different areas, in terms of issues of poverty, war and peace issues, and a whole range of other important ethical areas that emerge really from the Beatitudes, that emerge from Matthew in terms of the wheat and goats, St. James in terms of wealth and poverty. And so within the historic Anglican tradition, which is magisterial, unlike some forms of Christianity that retreat into a private devotional life, the Anglican heritage, and particularly its Catholic side, well, you find it in its Reformed and the best of its broad church side also, has this almost the genetic code of faith, is to be engaged with substantive issues in the public space and not retreating from the public square, but taking their life in light and living it with utmost commitment to bringing about the good in the state, the country, the world that they live in. And so within Anglicanism, part of the organic vision of the kingdom and church and state is that in fact we engage the magistrates, we're involved in the public realm, we do not retreat from those significant and substantive areas of life into an enclosed ghetto.
The one problem we experienced, particularly in Eastern Europe, with getting overly involved, was forgetting the boundary between Christ and Caesar. Mm-hmm. And I like to remind people that when you dance with Caesar, Caesar always leads. And in the East, in the state churches, and it happened for a period in Germany as well with Lutherans, that the imperial state so dominated the church that the church became, in many respects, ineffective and didn't carry out its real ministry because it was so tied together with the state that it became a department of the government. In Russia, that took place with the abolition of the patriarchate and the incorporation of the church into the ministry of religion, who was often an atheist, by the way, a non-believer, but he was the highest authority in the Orthodox Church, even though he was a layperson and often an atheist. Well, at least sometimes. And the church couldn't do anything without the government's approval. So that seems to me going a little bit too far, that you can no longer, in those circumstances, push the government toward justice. In Byzantium, it seems the church maintained somewhat more independence, and particularly when you had great leaders like John Chrysostom who would stand up to the emperor. But there is a point at which the church becomes a part of the political system and then loses its moral authority in the gospel because it's identified with one or another branch of politics. And then this could also present a problem. So there obviously, we might suggest anyway that there have to be boundaries. If you want the church to put your doctrine into civil law, you have to have so compromised yourself with the civil government that you're basically a department of the civil government. And then a lot of moral authority and ability to function has been lost. So that's something of a problem that I think one has to take into account when we talk about our responsibilities. Also is not to become a part of sucked into becoming a part of the political system as well.
How would you respond to that, Sister Nona?
Oh, that's quite true, and that's the opposite side of the dilemma. On the one hand, if there's no participation at all, there can be problems. And then if there's too much entanglement with the civil society, and with the government, with politics, there can be problems also.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, and Rodney, Anglican Church was one of the foremost leaders in the abolition of slavery and stopping slave trade. And that obviously came from the conscience of the church, what their responsibility was.
I think, yeah, there's two extremes that one always has to be wary of. One is, as you say, the church becoming a dancing bear or lapdog of the state. It really just serves imperial interests uncritically. And in that case, the church is rendered impotent, and it really becomes a plaything of power. The other, almost in a reaction to that, which goes the other stream, is people, and there are various forms of Christianity, which take the position that to be involved in any way with the state, you compromise, you get your hands dirty, you distort the faith, so you retreat from any political involvement into purist enclaves. I would say the via media, or the middle way, which you certainly find in the history of Anglicanism, whether it's, I mentioned St. Alban, or the clash between Becket and Henry, or in the 16th century, where certainly Latimer and Ridley and Cranmer were quite willing to confront the head of state, and they paid the price for doing so. Jewel had to flee to England when Mary took over. Hooker tried to, in the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, articulate a position which was a middle way between working with the state when the state on important issues embodied the highest of values, but when the state ceased to do so, that the church would stand as a prophetic critique of the state without retreating into privacy of a lack of engagement. So I think it's in that critical middle way that a prophetic view of the church both works with the state for the good of a country, but also works from the grassroots up. This is where parishes are about. So it's not just the state should do everything, but there's also the role from grassroots up, the important roles of the diocese and a parish in being there for people that are marginalized, that can't afford to make payments, that provide a whole range of social services which are not necessarily state-funded. And so it's how the church has to hold together important engagement at the level of politics, but also at the level of society, and that's another tension that has to be lived within.
Yeah. Ron, we remember part of the reason why the Roman Catholic Church began to collapse in Quebec, particularly at the time of what we call the Silent Revolution. One of the main complaints was that the priests were telling people how they had to vote, and that they might be stuck in purgatory if they voted for the wrong candidate or something, and interfering in the political system and people's own conscience and freedom to vote by trying to dictate who people should vote for. And as I recall, there was one lawsuit, and I can't remember where, and that would have been, I think, in the 1800s even, when the vote was overturned by the courts and they had to run the election again in that riding because the priests had dictated how people should vote. And the losing candidate suggested that it wasn't a free democratic vote. In the re-election, the re-vote, the man who had lost indeed won the election, didn't it? So that's I think one of the tendencies, the dangerous tendency, is for pastors, priests, ministers to try to dictate how their people should vote and tell them that it would be, say, a sin or a moral offense not to vote for the one that the priest thinks you should vote for, instead of allowing you to vote according to your own conscience and according to what you think is perhaps best for the nation and everything. And I think we find that today in the United States in particular. I haven't seen much of that here, but it does happen in the States sometimes. And it always strikes me that the Roman Catholic Church does that more than anyone else. And I keep being a little bit uneasy about that because I remember what happened in Quebec, and that was one of the big issues, was dictating how people should vote. So,
I thought it was the evangelicals of various kinds who did it the most.
well, they may, the Catholic Church more public about it, they can excommunicate people. Whereas
Yes.
excommunication doesn't really mean anything for evangelicals. But the fact that you wouldn't be able to take communion if you voted for the wrong candidate, that's been enunciated. So that's also one of the dangers. And so how do you see our ability to work with the state on social justice issues in particular?
I think we have to distinguish between questions of the overarching value, furthering the common good,
Mhm.
or caring for the poor, let's say. And then the factual question, which policy is going to do the most to further that?
Yeah.
And that factual question is where a lot of the political disagreements occur. One party says the free enterprise system will lift all boats and will help the poor the most. The other party says that they really need government support. And so there's an election. And people have to decide for one or for the other. But the fact is that people on both sides think that that their vote is furthering the common good, even though they're voting against each other. And so I think that people in good conscience, within limits, you're not going to be voting for the Nazis in good conscience, but within the mainstream, at least, of a 2 or 3 party system, you can have good conscience on both sides. And that's generally what happens in a democratic country. The problem is if the pastor is telling people they've got to vote on one side, otherwise they're going to be excommunicated, and the people on the other side may be voting that way for reasons of conscience that are morally legitimate for them because of what they believe will happen empirically. Then you have a problem, and you end up dividing the church. The one parish is Democratic, the other parish is Republican, and so the people from the other party aren't really welcome in your Christian community, but the Christian community is for everyone. And somehow we have to learn to listen to one another and get beyond these kinds of differences in our parishes.
Yeah, the parish isn't the place for that sort of thing.
I was thinking probably the two of the most important Canadian Anglicans of the 20th century have been Stephen Leacock and George Grant. And in 1919, Stephen Leacock wrote a powerful little tract called The Unsolved Riddle of Social Justice. And he pointed out in capitalism, certain goods are produced, but it can also create immense inequality. In which you have the winners, the entrepreneurs, the management, but you have the workers, the people who don't do well, and they're often marginalized. So he argued, in Canada we have to sort out what is the good of an entrepreneurial system and the downside. And then he turned to socialism. He said, what is the good of socialism and its concern with the common good, the role of the state in providing the common good, but what's the downside of socialism? And he explored that. And then he tried to synthesize, which is the unique Canadian high Tory or red Tory tradition, arguing, yes, there should be a place for the marketplace, enterprise, but you do need a significant role of the state to provide basic services such as universal health care, public education, employment insurance, and many other services. 1965, just church and state. Again, George Grant wrote one of who's considered probably the most important public intellectual Canada of the 20th century. He wrote The Powerful Lament for a Nation, in which he looked very closely at how Canada was slipping into the gravitational field of what he called imperial United States, and the impact of that on us as a culture, on our healthcare system, and a whole range of other things. And so you can see Grant very, very much at work trying to sort out what is the role of the In this case, the Anglican Church of Canada, which is probably one of the most significant forms of Christianity in Canada at that particular point in Canadian history. What does it mean to be a Canadian Anglican vis-a-vis the state? And how is the church meant to make sense of Canadian government and then the Canadian government's move towards the United States, in this case Vietnam, and a range of whole other issues at the time. So in Canadians, particularly our conservatism, it's almost the opposite of American conservatism. Historic Canadian high or red Tory conservative has a high place for the state, higher taxes, so we create a whole variety of social services from coast to coast in which no one should be at need on the basics of the human journey.
Yeah. That's always a difficult path, because consumer capitalism can only thrive by increasing people's passions and their desire. If you don't sell, but you can't sell to contentment, you can only sell to discontent. You can sell to the passions. You can sell to desire, but you cannot sell to contentment. And yet, happiness, the prerequisite for happiness is contentment. But in a consumer capitalist society, you have to believe that happiness is one more purchase away. And otherwise the system would collapse. People have to buy. And that poses certain moral problems as well. This, there's a short story that I read in college called "Christmas is a Sad Season for the Poor." And I often think about that when we talk about consumer capitalism. That kind of prosperity is a burden for the poor. And so we're moved from ordinary capitalism through laissez-faire, which has always been catastrophic, and into consumer capitalism, where to be a good citizen, you should consume. And it creates a real social injustice in society and real disparity in society, consumer capitalism. But it also provides a very delicate balance for the economic welfare, the well-being of the state also. And I wonder if either one of you would care to try to address that particular problem in the terms of the consumer capitalism and the problem of the fact that it makes a greater division between the poor and the rich, and also that it can only thrive by increasing human passions. I'll give you one example. I was speaking at University of Miami one time, and driving down there was a big billboard that said, "If you want it, you need it."
That's not always true.
Well, it's never true. No, never true.
Sometimes people do have real needs.
Yeah, of course they do.
And they need to have enough resources to provide for those needs. And more people in the United States are in that situation now. And so, I'd rather not comment on it any more than that.
Yeah, okay. Ron, do you have anything?
Well, I think the dilemma of a certain type of capitalism is it inflates human needs far beyond basic human wants.
Mm-hmm.
And then people become the victims of their own drivenness and almost an addiction to having the newest toy. And if they don't have it, they're restless. And so it perpetuates an illness of consumption that as soon as you've consumed something, you need something else to fulfill your emptiness. Mm. And so it's a cycle that leads to ever deeper illness, in which people are never working out of what T.S. Eliot calls that still point in the moving world, or the still point of their own soul, where the light is. And so you get in certain forms of capitalism a distortion of the human soul and desire, which then deepens the restlessness and even alienation from who they truly are as a human being. So they become imprisoned to their own drivenness, and they cease to be free, although they think they're free.
Yeah. But I want to suggest too, ask both of you to comment. It seems to me that one of the principal responsibilities that we should have to the culture, society, the world, well, the rest of society would be by a living example that we should set of the things that the Scripture commands us to be concerned about. And among those, of course, is compassionate love. And we don't necessarily have that within our own churches, always. That the strife that people see within the church is very often interpreted as the cause of the strife in society. And we don't always manage to set the kind of moral example. While we teach morality, we often teach it from a hypocritical point of view. And that's inevitable because none of us can live up to the things that we're required to preach, but we're still required to preach them because it's the ideal. But that within our own Christian community, the greater Christian community, and within our own particular churches, we don't always set the kind of example that perhaps we have a responsibility to the rest of society to be setting as an example. The ancient Christians conquered Rome through charity, through love, through opening their arms to everyone, and through being willing to die to testify that the power of death had been destroyed by Christ. And somehow it seems that we don't really have that kind of moral substance anymore, and because of that we've lost a great deal of our moral authority in society and culture. So
I would say that somehow or another Christians need to be taught and also to pray enough and have enough life experience to stop having contempt for other people, for those who are different from ourselves, for those who may have committed a sin. You know, you just look at the sin, you don't look at everything else about the person. We need to learn to begin to discern virtues in people other than ourselves.
yes.
And eventually we'll recognize that those virtues come from Christ, whether the people know it or not. This is just my opinion. And that the Holy Spirit may be at work where we don't know it, outside of the church as we know it. And we may find friends in unlikely places.
Romanides was actually my first teacher one time said, we know where grace is, we don't know where it is not.
So if
We don't set the boundaries.
When Christians
we don't set the boundaries.
are seen to have contempt for others,
Yes.
or even be cultivating contempt for others, it's not good for their own souls, and it's certainly not good for the image of the church and society as a whole.
Yes, truly. Ron, do you have a comment?
I was thinking, being attentive, Simon Weil would use the term, to where grace is not. C.S. Lewis, another well-known Anglican who was very involved with the Society of St. Alban and St. Serge when he was alive, did a little book called The Abolition of Man, and the appendix in it is called The Tao, in which he points that in many of the great traditions of the world, we cannot help but detect the feel of grace. And then in his first of his great Christian classics, The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, when the great battle is over, many who didn't seem to be of Aslan were in fact of Aslan, but they may have not known it initially. And so we often can, or we think we can detect where grace is, but we often don't know until the end where grace isn't. And I think it's that ability to wait and be silent for the final answer.
Sometimes people think they're rejecting God, but what they're actually rejecting is a caricature. It's something that God is not that's being rejected.
Well, thank God judgment isn't for us to make, it's for God to make, because He's merciful and we seldom are. That's it. I think we're going to have to conclude our broadcast for the moment. And thank you all for joining us, and especially thank our sister Nona, who's traveled considerable distance to be with us for, and tomorrow we'll have the conference of the society, the fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius. St. Alban was the first martyr in Britain. He's in both calendars, ours and the Orthodox and the Anglican. And we need to remember how much of the ancient church is to be found to this day in the United Kingdom, and how much of the history of the church was shaped and formed there, including Constantine the Great. And it's a great pleasure to have Ron Dart, and of course Ron's almost always here. He's co-chair with me of the St. Alban and St. Sergius chapter here on the West Coast. And really it was through his efforts that this chapter exists. And so we're trying to cooperate and help make it work. So thank you all for joining us, and we ask for your prayers. And join us on the Canadian Orthodox Broadcasting.ca as well as the YouTube channel. Good evening. There you go.